Let's talk about the How to Train Your Dragon remake. 15 years ago, DreamWorks Animation released How to Train Your Dragon, which was loosely based on the children's book series of the same name by Cressida Cowell. The film was a critical and commercial success, bringing in nearly $500 million, earning 2 Academy Award nominations, and eventually spawning a full-fledged franchise with 2 more movies, 3 TV show spin-offs, countless video games, dozens of comic books, an ice show, and most recently, a live-action remake. Now, if you're familiar with this channel, then you know that I have a history of ragging on remakes, but I promise I'm not just being a hater for the hell of it. In fact, there are dozens of remakes like The Parent Trap, You've Got Mail, The Thing, and Ocean's 11 that I actually prefer to the original movie. My issues are more so with the recent trend of remakes spearheaded by Disney, who've adapted over 20 of their animated classics to live action since 2010, a number that honestly sends a chill up my spine. Although reception to these films have been mixed, with most of them bringing in over $500 million, it's no surprise that the company has continued to turn them out one after another. Other animation studios like DreamWorks, Illumination, Warner Brothers, and Studio Ghibli have large enough back catalogs to have considered the same cash grab strategy, but they've held off. Until now, that is. And even though the How to Train Your Dragon trilogy only reached its conclusion a mere 6 years ago, DreamWorks has decided that's more than enough time for it to receive the live-action treatment. Now, as someone who thought that the original How to Train Your Dragon movies were a work of art, I wasn't really into the idea of a remake to begin with. After all, how can you improve on perfection? But after watching it, I can safely say that it's more palatable than most live-action attempts. Unlike Disney, who have a habit of trying to correct things that were never a real issue, inadvertently ruining the film's characters, pacing, and message, How to Train Your Dragon is unabashedly faithful to its source material. Because barely anything is removed or added, it's like they've just put the original movie through a live-action filter. And I'm not exaggerating. Almost all of the camera angles and dialogue are pulled directly from its animated counterpart, so it's essentially a one-to-one recreation. Because of that, you're still left wondering why this movie exists, but since the thing it's copying is so good to begin with, there's nothing about it that's actively unpleasant. And I genuinely think that if you brought a kid to watch it who had never seen the original, they wouldn't feel like they were missing out. That isn't to say there aren't any differences between the live-action and animated versions of How to Train Your Dragon, but they're so small, only a hardcore fan would even notice. They make a point of mentioning that Berk is made up of various Viking tribes, hence its more diverse population, but it doesn't actually impact the story, although I do wonder if it'll play a larger role in the sequels. Hiccup's interactions with the other dragons changes a bit. He doesn't see the terrible terrors fighting with each other, or use dragon nip during their training sessions, but that doesn't make a huge difference in the grand scheme of things either. Because the live action uses the same dialogue as the animated version, it's very easy to compare the casts, and I do think there are certain character choices and deliveries that aren't as strong. Some people took offense to Rough Nut and Tough Nut no longer being identical twins, but I was more bothered by their personalities, which I personally didn't find quite as annoying. In the original movie, there are genuinely times where all you want them to do is shut up, which is really funny. Here, they're more quirky. I did like how they expanded on Snotlout's motivations and backstory, and we learned that the reason he acts so arrogantly is because he just wants his father's attention and approval. I just wish that we'd seen that impact his friendship with Hiccup a bit more, since they can both relate to being disappointments. I do think that they absolutely nailed the casting for Fishlegs, and I wouldn't have minded seeing a few more dragon fanboy moments. Having Gerard Butler play both the animated and live-action versions of Stoic does feel a bit obvious, but I think he did a good job, even if he doesn't quite nail the original's physicality. Not that I blame him, considering he's wearing several layers of furs that definitely made it difficult to get around. On the other hand, I didn't love Nick Frost as Gobber. It just felt like he was trying too hard to be funny, and you wind up missing out on the character's softness underneath his hardened exterior. I also wasn't sold on the live-action version of Hiccup, who just feels a bit too dashing and sincere. Considering they weren't afraid of being a shot-for-shot remake, I'm surprised they didn't play up the animated character's awkwardness and sarcasm, especially considering those behaviors are what make him such an unusual protagonist. I know a lot of people complained about the casting of Nico Parker as Astrid, cause racism. But if you pay attention to the original movie, Astrid is just supposed to be hot. That's literally the only reason Hiccup likes her at the beginning. And if you don't think that Nico Parker is attractive, then I highly recommend getting your eyes checked. If you rewatch the original film, you'll notice that Astrid is actually a pretty one-note character, and most of her development doesn't happen until the sequels. In this sense, I think the live action is actually an improvement. Because she and Hiccup interact a lot more, she's less of a manic pixie dream girl, and having her express her own insecurities and aspirations makes her a lot more relatable. I do wish we'd seen a bit more softness from her though, since she winds up feeling very closed off for most of the movie, so her and Hiccup's romance does come across a bit forced. In interviews, Mason Thames and Nico Parker have great chemistry, but I don't think it translates on screen. Maybe because their depictions of the characters are so reserved in general, you don't really feel the love, but that's something they can fix pretty easily in subsequent installments. One thing that I found particularly impressive were the visual effects. So far, Disney has only adapted their traditionally animated movies to live action, which results in some noticeable changes when it comes to character designs and art styles that can wind up in uncanny valley territory. But since How to Train Your Dragon was already computer animated to begin with, they just wound up reusing a lot of the character models. As a result, the creatures are still familiar to us, but with some minor changes that help make them look a bit more realistic to fit the new visuals. And as a whole, I just love how the franchise's dragons are so different from what we're used to seeing. However, I did think that this version of Toothless was missing some of the charm of the original. I'm not sure what it was, maybe his expressions weren't exaggerated enough, but in general, I felt like his cute moments weren't as believable as his angry ones. I watched a 10 p.m. showing of How to Train Your Dragon, so I wasn't surprised by the lack of children. But what did take me aback were the sheer amount of adults carrying around toothless plushies and wearing How to Train Your Dragon graphic tees from Hot Topic. I guess all of these companies were onto something when they decided to capitalize on nostalgia. Now, if only they put half as much effort into telling original stories, then we'd have creativity coming out the wazoo. One thing that's important to understand about these animation studios is that they're not just for creative endeavors, but are an extension of the company's other business ventures. For instance, Disney's theme parks and resorts bring in over $34 billion annually, while their merchandise sales bring in an additional $5 billion. Even with hits like Inside Out 2 and the live-action Lion King, the film division makes almost nothing in comparison. But what these movies fail to do financially, they're able to make up for in marketing. By releasing all of these sequels and remakes, Disney is able to keep their IP in the public eye, allowing them to capitalize on their existing fan base, or alternatively, introduce the product to new customers. It's that line of thinking that's resulted in a new Star Wars trilogy for every generation. For anyone unaware, DreamWorks and Illumination are subsidiaries of Universal Studios. And what has Universal been up to lately? Why, they just opened a brand spanking new theme park in Florida. Epic Universe is made up of 4 themed lands: Dark Universe, Super Nintendo World, the Wizarding World of Harry Potter, and the Isle of Berk, with each relating to one of the company's existing franchises. They're also working on Universal Kids Resort, which is projected to open in 2026, and will have 7 themed lands inspired by other franchises including Shrek, Jurassic World, Trolls, SpongeBob SquarePants, and Despicable Me. Not so coincidentally, every single franchise featured in these new parks is being revitalized on screen. There was The Last Wish in 2022, the Super Mario Bros. Movie in 2023, and Jurassic World Rebirth and How to Train Your Dragon in 2025. Not to mention the dozens of other projects in the works like the Harry Potter TV series, Minions 3, and Shrek 5. With that in mind, it's pretty obvious that the live-action How to Train Your Dragon was nothing more than an elaborate marketing stunt for Universal's theme parks. And while I find the animated movie to be far superior, all things considered, it could have been a lot worse. It's a low bar, I know, but it's true. I credit the film's watchability to director Dean DeBlois, who also worked on the original trilogy, and I think you can really feel his love and care on screen, something that's even more apparent when you take into account that DeBlois didn't return to direct the live-action Lilo and Stitch movie, which was totally devoid of the heart and soul of the original. I still don't think that this movie needed to be made, but in a lineup of live-action remakes, it's near the top. I just hope that this doesn't inspire Universal to make a live-action Minions movie, because that would be pure nightmare fuel. What did you think of the live-action How to Train Your Dragon movie? I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!